on the light.
Sorry.
Oh. Sorry. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. The problem with the glorification of like a good citizen happens in the real world in two different ways, right? Firstly, in countries that do actually take care of their citizens equitably, and we believe that's likely to be in a country where communities are relatively well taken care of. Sure, there might be a majority community in these situations, but the minority communities are more or less like looked after well enough, right? And also these communities are the most likely to already have an inherent like appreciation and like do value like social responsibility themselves, as well as like already have a somewhat strong national identity, right? I think in a situation whereby your nation takes care of everyone quite equitably and like you know, everyone is living a relatively decent life, you're more than likely to have a strong national identity anyways, right? The problem here is in countries that don't actually take care of their citizens well, right? So meaning that like a large, you have communities that are largely segmented, like a majority community that largely oppresses a lot of the minority and disenfranchised communities in their nation, right? So this means that in these countries where like we believe this debate takes place most importantly in, there's a disproportionate treatment of like minority and underprivileged groups, right? So where's the problem here, right? I think the likelihood that how this glorification looks like in these countries is that firstly, people name and shame people who criticize the government's policies, right? Especially in situations whereby you are a minority and disenfranchised group, you are the ones who are most likely to be the ones criticizing your country and saying, well, I live in a shit country, they literally oppress me, right? And secondly, a large proportion of the population thinks the country can do no wrong, right? And I think it is quite intuitive to understand like why thinking your country has no room for improvement and it's like one of the greatest countries in the world, e.g. America, is particularly bad. And thirdly, minorities and disenfranchised people are not looked after, but even more firmly like oppressed, right? But before that, I'll take your POI.
From closing?
Sorry. From opening, yeah.
Without this narrative, what narrative do people use to subscribe to citizenship of a nation?
Yes, so like I already mentioned, right? Like I think the problem, the benefits that opposition will try to sell you on like the glorification of this narrative only occurs well in doesn't necessarily require the narrative to like obtain any of those benefits, right? I already explained to you how it's likely to happen that in countries where like the citizens are relatively well taken care of is where most of the benefits are actually largely minimalized, right? So the benefits that they'll try to argue, like basically, oh, you protect like the like already built like system within certain countries, occurs like most horribly and is used most efficiently in countries that do this badly, right? So I've already explained to you what this glorification looks like. So I think the large problem here is, firstly, is that it paints minorities as bad citizens and not like people who have their own needs, wants and needs, right? So why this is likely to happen, right? Firstly, it places the burden on sociological issues and systemical issues on individuals, right? For example, all good citizens, if a nation's citizens are all good, that therefore you have a good nation. I think that is empirically false, right? I think the point in which like countries like the US, for example, uses the media to emphasize particular minority actions, right? Like say one African American person robs a convenience store. Now they single it out as a black action and utilize it, and because that person is now a bad citizen, they're able to use that as a kind of like facade to like target and oppress the African American communities in America, right? This means that all individuals in that minority are now seen as bad citizens, right? Because the community, that particular community is the one that contributes these bad citizens in the narrative, right? Secondly, I think the point at which a country that requires work is now like indoctrinating the majority in that nation to see bad citizens as like the reason for collapse of society and like some harms that the governments have conducted. This leads to like firstly two problems, right? Firstly is that it distracts the public from systemic issues compared to like blaming your government and actually wanting to enact change with the government. This means that these majority groups see, like very clear in the US, right? Don't see the problems of current America as like a government fault or like a citizen, like a government fault, but instead start to blame it on other communities, right? We see that very clearly in like the fact that instead of trying to fix their own problems, what they say is they blame everything on the Mexicans, and like the Mexicans literally contribute, who come into the US now become bad citizens and therefore cause a lot of the problems we see today. Secondly, they use individual bad actors to isolate, further isolate disenfranchised communities. This means that you're unable to access like a lot of the potential political capital as a minority community to actually get the change that you're trying to attain, right? So, moving past that, right? I think it's also very important for the country, right? For two reasons, right? First and foremost, in socio-political growth, right? I think what opposition will likely argue is that a lot of these segregation that we're trying to argue for will happen in either side of the world with or without this narrative, and in particular, they might believe that this narrative actually reduces that. But I say here that there's a problem here, right? Because in their world, what's likely to happen is these political and these religious and religious and divisive groups are more likely to use the narrative of a good citizen and a bad citizen to actually push the cause and hide behind it as a means to obtain the divisiveness that they're trying to achieve, right? So what this looks like is for example, a religious group, the news articles release a piece about a Muslim person, say robbing a bank or doing something bad, like a crime, right? What happens is the Buddhist, the Christian community, for example, in America, will then say, hey, look at all these Muslims, right? They are bad citizens, therefore we should get rid of them and move them out of the country, right? So, whereas in our counterfactual, what's likely to happen is that these groups do not have the reasoning or the rationale to actually frame it that way, and is unable to do so in our world, right? Secondly, government policy, right? I think the point in which every citizen in your country thinks that your country can do no wrong, and it's everyone's the reasons for your success is not because of good government policy, but because every citizen is good and socially responsible. I think that's particularly problematic because now you no longer have citizens who want to enact change and want to see the faults in your country, and are therefore unable to access a lot of the benefits of actually monitoring and adjusting your policies to match the needs and wants of the people at the time. Because of those reasons, so far that's proposed.
Great, thank you very much for the speech, and I now welcome the leader of the opposition.
Sorry, it's just easier to read on my laptop there. Two things in the speech. Firstly, why we just broadly improve society and encourage people to just act more nicely to people around them and be more committed to the success and well-being of the communities. And secondly, why we create notions of citizenship, which in the counterfactual are far more likely to be discriminatory or oppressive and unlock all of the harms that open government wants to tell you about. I think firstly, why do we just broadly improve society and have people act more altruistically? Firstly, in setup. I think the first thing to know is I think this narrative is framed around your individual actions and the way you perceive the individual actions of others, or the examples of the intro slide are about individuals taking on personal responsibility, caring about the communities. I think that a lot of open government's case relies on you thinking that this frames how people interact with their government or how they perceive the obligations they have to their government. I don't think there's ever any analysis for why this specific narrative, or the glorification of it, makes it so that people are unwilling to challenge the government. I don't think that this is particularly relevant to this debate. So what does relevant mean? I think three things. Firstly, glorification, first in terms of what glorification looks like. I think it just means that this message is constantly embedded into people in terms from a very young age. People internalize it very strongly. When you're a kid, your parents tell you to be nice to your neighbors. At school, your teachers tell you to share and tell you it's about being a good citizen, to share, to not litter, be a tidy Kiwi, all those sorts of things. But I think secondly, I think this narrative is also framed positively, because it's not that you are being guilted or shamed into not doing something bad. It is framed in a way that you're a good person if you do these things. I think that's also quite important. And I think in terms of the qualities that do get glorified, it's mostly just the ones in the info slide, right? Being compassionate about others, taking on personal responsibility, having a respect for law and order, sure.
Are people shamed for breaking the law?
yeah, they're shamed for breaking the law either way, but I think uniquely what happens on our side is that there is also a positive reason why you want to uphold and be a law-abiding citizen, even in the circumstances in which you think it is unlikely that you actually get caught or face the punishment. And that looks like a lot of instances like drunk driving, where often people don't think that they're going to be caught, and so you need positive reason why people care about the communities enough to still avoid doing things which should be harmful. So I think for why this improves communities, 4 mechanisms. Firstly, I think people just go out of their way to help others more. People are told from a very young age and have this narrative embedded throughout their lives that they should, when possible, help other people. I think that's just good, and sure, maybe to some extent this happens either way, but what's unique about this narrative is that it tells that you should help everyone within your country, not just the people who are close or proximate to you or who you feel some obligation to. So maybe on government side, you still help your your parents whenever they need a hand, but uniquely you also go out of your way to help other parts of your community because you feel an obligation to help all citizens, not just those who are the most proximate to you. Secondly, it just removes the burdens on others because you act in ways which don't incur costs on others. Like I said, people being more respectful of the law probably makes them least likely on the margins to do things like drink and drive, to do tax fraud, even just like litter or graffiti places, which do just impose costs onto others. But I think it additionally just means that there's also less cost that has to be spent on enforcing law, because if people just generally are more respectful of the law, you need less people to enforce them in the first place, and just frees up government resources for other things. I think thirdly, people just vote in less self-interested ways. They care more about the broader well-being of the community and not just their own self-interest. And lastly, people just trust each other more. They're more and I think that just makes people happier and communities nicer and more pleasant to be in. So I think end of this, I think it just means people's lives are just broadly better. If you need support, you're more likely to be able to access it because there's more likely to be charities that operate which are well funded and have volunteers. You're more likely to be able to, if nothing else, ask your neighbor for a hand when you need it. I think that just makes people's day-to-day lives quite a bit more pleasant, and that is a benefit which accrues to everyone which lives within the country, even if you think that that's relatively low impact for any individual person. I think just living in a more supportive community multiplied by 8 billion people is a really significant benefit in this debate. So I think lastly then quickly on what the counterfactual looks like and why it's very harmful. I think the important thing with this narrative is that it's not just a narrative that you should do good things, but this is a narrative that is specifically tied to the social construct of citizenship. That is what lets you access the identity of being a good citizen of that country is positive acts. So let's look at what the counterfactual is, because either way, the concept of citizenship broadly exists on either side. And for this to exist, you obviously need to, not everyone can be a citizen. You still need some sort of criteria that defines what is it, who can access this national identity, who can access this concept of citizenship and be included in a national society. So why is the comparative likely to be things which are much more exclusive and much more alienating? I think firstly, the way most countries and most nation states form is along these explicitly ethnic and geographical or linguistic lines. Most of the nation states of Europe, which originated the system, were split explicitly along linguistic and ethnic lines. Countries in the post-colonial age often followed this model, and nations were often split more or less along these sorts of lines. I think that means that in the counterfactual, the ways people subscribe to the most relevant identities people hold and the way that they, when required to define concepts of identity, the national identity, define them, is along those same characteristics, because it means you define what it means to be an Indian citizen, not based on whether or not you care about your community or whether or not you go and do positive acts and respect the law, but whether or not you subscribe to a specific religious or ethnic or linguistic identity around being Hindi. I think that's just the most likely counterfactual. The government needs to explain why that's not the case. No, thank you. I think why is this just a much better way of characterizing identity? I think firstly because no one is structurally locked out of accessing identity that is based on the individual actions that you have the agencies to undertake, right? If the main way you can assert your identity as part of a wider national identity system is to just do good things and do positive acts, I think that's just quite accessible. Comparatively, if to subscribe to identity, you need to belong to a certain religion or come from a certain ethnic background. That's just much more exclusive, and I think the comparative, and that looks like, for example, the narrative of the White Australia policy or other much more ethnic or religious characterizations of citizenship, which exist in a lot of post-colonial states. But I think secondly, even in the cases where the characteristics by which citizenship is defined are not explicitly lock people out, I think that they often do just force people to make compromises with other parts of their identity, because notably when you define citizenship along just doing good things, that's not exclusive with any other aspect of your identity. So you don't have to subscribe to a majority religion, you don't have to speak a different language to your kids, you can access a national identity that's based on a common language of English or Bahasa Indonesia or what have you. It just means that people never have to be forced into making these sorts of sacrifices for other aspects of their identity. Thirdly, I think this does just provide a mechanism to shift perceptions of communities towards more positive ones. I think it's really important in the way that immigrant communities in a lot of countries have been able to access integration into the wider society. So Xavier tells me about Greek immigrants in Australia. I don't know, I'm Australian, but that sounds pretty good to me. And that is just really good in terms of just putting an avenue through which communities can access integration and access the benefits of being accepted within the broader national identity system, which mitigates a lot of the worst harms that opening government tells you about. To quickly respond to what opening government tells you here, I think firstly a lot of the harms that they're trying to impact onto minority communities rely on this being a narrative which applies in terms of how you perceive your state, because a lot of it is like, oh, but like you can't criticize your state if you're in a minority community. I don't see how that changes with the narrative we tell you. I don't think this is connected to the narrative as it's defined within this debate. So I will give you the rest of the responses actually.
Great, thank you so much for that speech, and I now welcome DPM.
I might need to take a break in my speech because I've got the worst headache.
No worries.
What we're saying on our side is that the narrative of the good citizen is specifically the narrative that enables prejudice on a societal scale and enables that prejudice to be actioned in ways by that society against minorities, and that in the absence, in our real counterfactual, other narratives would occur that would still allow society to function in a way that we think is good. I'm going to start off with some rebuttal. I'm then going to rebuild what we think the harms of the good citizen narrative are in a very specific way here, and how they are weaponized by states. Then I'm going to compare with the existence of other narratives and the arguments that we just got out, and I'm ultimately going to tell you why you should vote right bench. Okay, first, just a couple of points of rebuttal from Owe. One of them, the first major thing that Owe says is that without this narrative, people would have no reason to otherwise do things which benefit society, i.e. you might still want to break the law if you thought you couldn't get caught because you don't have an inbuilt sense of that you should be a good person and not commit crimes. What I would notice is that other narratives still exist. One, the narrative of a good person still exists, and this is a really clear key distinction, because you can be a good moral person and not be a good citizen to a state that you disagree with under their narrative. And what this means, for example, is that white murderers are not seen as inherently bad citizens of America, they are seen as bad human beings prima facie. And so what we think is that you still have moral impetus that comes from your community to do good things for that community. The second thing, and I'll spend the latter half of my speech talking about this, is that there is a transactional relationship that exists in good societies between the citizens and the society itself. So we think that the alternative narrative that occurs in many societies is that I do beneficial actions for my society, i.e. paying taxes, because I know that leads to beneficial outcomes for me and my family and my regional local community. The second thing that they say is that this is a good way to enable minorities to get ahead in societies because they can take good citizenship actions. I think this is just fundamentally untrue, and I'll spend the rest of my speech proving why it's untrue, but just as a bit of intuition, Obama is seen as a good human by a lot of Americans, but he is seen as a bad American, not because he made actions against America, but because he was bad because he was black, i.e. all of these stereotypes that attach to black people in America become attached to him, and he is therefore, his citizenship and right to be there is questioned. He was seen as a Muslim, he was seen as not a true American, precisely as an extension of the good citizen narrative. Okay, what does the good citizen narrative look like and why is it so bad? What it does, very clearly to restate Andy's point. One, it defines general categories about actions that are good for society and bad society. Then media in your country against the minority will almost always pick out a particular characteristic or action by members of that minority that is a bad action seen as bad against society. So for example, American media focuses heavily on crimes by black individuals, but then the next step is that media then makes no distinction between the actions of the individuals and the group. This is standard racism, but the critical point is that the group is then now painted as prima facie bad citizens because that group is seen as taking actions by the nature of who they are that are against society. And therefore it is very easy under this narrative to paint particular minorities as being bad for society. I would note that in the absence of the good citizen narrative, clearly prejudice still exists, right? But what gets removed is the ability to easily weaponize that prejudice against an entire group, and critically for the state to weaponize that prejudice as saying, this group is a bad set of citizens, so we ought to take actions against them. I would also note that similar things occur for Muslim minorities. The values of some individual Muslims, i.e. non-democratic values or particular sexism, become in the media become applied broadly to all Muslims and then used as a categorization reason of why that group is bad for society en masse, which can then be used to justify other political rhetoric. Closing, please.
Good citizenship often manifests in institutionally productive ways, for example, schooling and scouts in ways that benefits communities. Please respond.
Yes, I'll get to that in a second. So, what do I think the comparative looks like with other narratives? Because as well as the good citizenship narrative that might occur in Scouts, for example, there are other narratives. There is the narrative that one ought be nice to children, that one ought learn and teach skills, that one ought make a value of their life that is not just themselves, but is also the society around them. I note that people don't go into Scouts to be a good citizen of their country. They go into Scouts to be a good member of their community who helps and benefits those around them. So what do I think the comparative narratives look like? We think two forms of comparative narratives come up in the two situations that we gave. One, we think there is a sense of social responsibility and a rule of law that exists as the relationship that you have to the people around you. I don't want to break the window of my local supermarket because I know that harms the individual members of my community. Secondly, I know that there is a legal retribution that is likely. But much more importantly, we think the other narrative that occurs is a transactional narrative between me and my broader society. So what this looks like is that the majority takes good actions that the society wants them to do, specifically at the point the society rewards those actions. So I go to university because I know that my country will pay for my university, will help me through it, etc., etc. Why is this so important, particularly for minorities? Because it means that the minorities now have a distinct incentive, and the government has an incentive, to have a positive transactional relationship between those two people. So the government now has an incentive in this world to do good things for minorities, such that the minorities will therefore do good things for the states. And what we also think is that this changes the narrative, because bad actions by minorities against the state by the majority are no longer seen as bad actions prima facie, but they are seen as a response to the state's failure to benefit that minority in a way that it needs to, given its circumstances. The other thing that the really important thing I want to say, right, is that the impacts, okay, this is critically why people are more likely to support minorities challenging government views, because it changes the narrative that the act of a minority in being, in this world, a bad citizen who can be outright dismissed, becomes a much more understandable narrative when it is a failure of the state to properly interact with that minority and help that minority. I would still note, of course, that racism and sexism still exist. We can't solve that in its whole. But what we can do is decouple the existence of those prejudices from the fact that a state ought not take action to benefit a particular minority, or even a majority in the case of women, right? Therefore, what we say is that on our comparative, we have a more transactional society that is better. The final thing, the implication, right, is that there are probably certain things that you do need the good citizen narrative to achieve, and I would say that is particularly war and defending your state. But we believe that is only relevant at the point that your state has failed you. And we say that in that instance, we would rather that society be changed or not exist, because at the point that the good citizen narrative is the only thing that can compel you to protect your society, even if it fails you in other ways, we say that society ought to be different or changed in some way. Very positive.
Great, thank you so much for that speech. And to end the top half, I now welcome the yellow.
If I asked you 100 years ago what a good Australian citizen looked like, the answer was exclusively white Christians. Belonging was based on race and religion. Now, I hope a good Australian looks like someone who is caring for their community, someone who is personally responsible, someone who is respectful for law and authority, who does not seek the breakdown of society. And note that that is incredibly important because it explains why this is a positive aspiration that moves societies in the correct direction. But it also explains why this is a narrative which is not exclusive to a fundamental characteristic of a person. It is a narrative that everyone can buy into. A couple of questions then on who can buy into this narrative, and then on to what opening government tries to push constructively in this debate. Because I think the best challenge in any narratives debate, or any glorification debate, is to say, well, a set of people can't buy into this narrative because they're structurally excluded from society. But I would just observe, one, this is not a narrative which structurally excludes people in any sort of capacity. And if you are in the absolute worst case for us that opening government tries to push, if this is the worst society where there is explicit and outright oppression of minorities, it's unclear why those groups ever want to buy into society in the first place. It's unclear why you want to buy into being a citizen of a country that oppresses you all the time. I would look at a whole series of indigenous communities in Australia who don't recognise the sovereignty of Australia. I would look at Muslim communities in India who just reject the authority of the Hindu-Vata government over them and the BJP to control it. So I would note that a lot of those groups don't want to be a good citizen. They don't care about the good citizen narrative. And the racism which affected their lives was underlying, and not because of a narrative that said you should be a good citizen. It was because these people believed that they were superior to you by virtue of religion or by virtue of race or by virtue of birth. Obviously, the reason that people discriminate against someone comes from a whole series of other structural factors and was not a consequence of saying someone is a good citizen and then when a Muslim does something bad, that's ascribed to all Muslims. And I'll explain why that just doesn't work as analysis for opening government in a moment. Let's have a look then at what opening government does tell us, but just like a note on the actual interaction in the top half of this debate. Because opening government can only win this debate if you believe all of the characterization that they've given you in bad communities. If I can mitigate that to a reasonably large extent, I'm going to flip it all, but even if you only believe I can mitigate it to a large extent, they just accept that in good and positive constructive societies, this is just a necessarily good narrative that improves communities, which I think makes it a tough day to be closing government in this debate, but also just gives you a reason to believe that we only need it to be okay enough in the worst circumstances for this to be a generally positive narrative to glorify overall. So, they tell us in these bad countries that, actually I might go with the cases that they tell us it's good first, because they also tell us that it's good in cases of war because you get an extra bit of tipping point, but if your country is at war then you will fundamentally fail. I would observe that most of the wars fought over the last 100 or so years are actually probably fairly decent. I don't think the United States should collapse because they defended women's rights in Afghanistan for 25 years. I don't think that the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union should have collapsed because they fought the Nazis in Europe. I would just observe there are a whole series of reasons to go to war to defend other people, and you are much more likely to be willing to go to defend other people when you believe it is your duty as a citizen to help others. Obviously, that tips you into those more positive cases that opening government describes there. So then, what does opening government give us constructively in this debate? They tell you that in the quote-unquote bad countries where people are exclusively oppressed, that a large portion of the country thinks that they can do no wrong, but obviously this is true because of the underlying factor of being in the majority. You think you're in the majority, you vote for governments who support your ideas, and those governments reinforce those your superiority by passing laws that advantage your group. I would observe the BJP in India passing laws that are favourable to the Hindu majority population. Note then that that large portion of the country thinking they can do no wrong operates because of a structural factor by being a majority, not by virtue of the narrative that they said they were good citizens. So it's incredibly unclear where this change in feeling like you belong occurs on opening government. The next thing they tell us is that this paints minorities as bad citizens. We would flip this and explain that what this narrative does is individualizes bad behaviour away from collective groups. Because when your citizenship and when your being a good citizen is based on whether your religion or your race or your ethnicity, then as a whole group you can be tossed out as one. You can be said, yes, that group is inferior to us. But when it is individual, when individual citizens take bad actions, it is not Muslims as a whole who do this wrong. It is this one person who has violated the expectations of a good citizen. But you can equally well observe that there are many people of that same group who have integrated into your community. And I would note that in Victoria, in post-World War II, there was a significant number of refugees coming from Italy and Greece. And yes, there was racism that existed against these groups, but largely these groups were integrated into society by virtue of buying into this good citizenship narrative, by building communities that supported the other communities, by engaging in these sort of practices, which they could engage in because being an Australian wasn't being Anglo-Saxon. It was being part of a community. It was caring about others. It was engaging in all those sort of positive behaviours which we outline. That is how minorities are able to integrate more meaningfully in these communities. The next claim on opening government is that this distracts from systemic issues. But obviously, this is firstly just not the tool used to distract from systemic issues. But also, systemic issues are incredibly difficult to fix. But a strong sense of community ameliorates the worst harm of systemic issues, because you can band together, you can have a positive life experience within your community that is less affected and more resistant to the systemic harm done to the oppressed group. The next thing I tell you is important,
Point.
Yeah, I'll take CG.
At Leader of Opposition, you said that there is already punishment for people who breach these norms and what should be a good citizen. Would you say this not only nukes opening government, who can no longer rely on punishment, but also nukes your own benefit, because people are already incentivized to be good citizens because of that punishment?
Oh my god. As we explained to you at training, this is a positive reason to be a good citizen because you're told it is rewarding. Obviously, there are still going to exist law and order and structure which operates independently, but it's just incredibly unclear to me. And by your nodding, I assume you were just trying to distract me with that POI. So I'm going to move on. The next thing on then is why is just some of the extraneous responses that opening government make. Because they tell you that you can be a good person without being a good citizen. And yes, other narratives exist, as Tony explains, but what Tony explains to you very clearly is where our narrative tips people into being slightly better citizens all the time. But note that on the comparative, opening government never tells you why this narrative is the one that tips into racism, and the existence of other narratives on opening government just nukes their own benefit. The next thing they tell you is Obama was seen as a Muslim and black, and he was seen as a good person but not a good American? Really? It is plainly absurd to believe that the American populace elected a dude for 2 terms who still has a 65% approval rating, and they thought he wasn't a very good American. Obviously, if America was a country where your citizenship value was based on your race or your religion, then he would have had a much more difficult time becoming the president and a much more difficult time becoming popular. But because he could buy into those values of what is a good American, being independent from that, it was incredibly plausible for him to be seen as a good citizen, for him to be elected. Citizenship is so important because it's how you enjoy your community. It is how you enjoy your life. It's how you go out and vote and change policy that improves your life. It is incredibly important to allow people to access citizenship. It is incredibly important not to just say a good citizen is what I say it is.
Great, thank you so much for top half, and now welcome the other member.
Very often, norms will punish transgressions but also celebrate those that abide by them. And that's how the opening opposition suggests that this norm works. They suggest that when you do things like break laws and be a bad or harmful citizen, you're likely to suffer social backlash, you're likely to suffer material harms to your person, all of which would still exist on their side, and suggest that in the world of opposition, you don't actually get people suddenly becoming bad citizens, because they're already incredibly strong incentives to do so. And that's actually the massive problem with this opening half, because they talk a lot about this question of punishment. They talk a lot about the question of whether or not people ought or ought not be punished for being bad citizens, and not enough about specifically what happens when you glorify the select few people who are able to be seen as good citizens. So our extension is going to do a few things. The first thing we're going to explain is why it is true that this punishment likely exists anyway, therefore symmetricizing the majority of the opening opposition case, but also explain why our subsequent extensions are more important than opening government. Secondly though, just explain why this is a mechanism for societies to exploit labour from the most vulnerable to keep those societies propped up, and why in the counterfactual you're likely to reward them in far more material ways. And third of all, explain why this is an inaccessible glorification to the kind of people that opening opposition needs it to be, which Angela will expand on a web given that is rebuttal. First of all, why does this punishment exist anyway? Opening government rests their case on the fact that some groups are not going to be seen as good, which means that they are likely to suffer, which is true, but is taken out a lot by opening opposition's observation that these groups are likely to be seen as bad anyway if you pay a lot of attention to, for instance, these groups are committing crimes. The The problem is that often these norms do punish people who fail to abide by them, but also reward those that do. So, for example, we often celebrate people who abide by, for instance, social norms around body standards, but also punish people who breach those social norms. We suggest that the likely counterfactual is just you only punish people who breach norms, and this is a common counterfactual. So, for instance, kindness in interpersonal relationships often works on a basis of people expect kindness, and so they never reward you if you offer them kindness, but they would punish you if you were, for instance, mean or harsh to that person. We just suggest that in the counterfactual, no one gives awards to people who are upstanding citizens. We don't give plaques to people who are good community servants just because, for instance, their father was a mayor or because they had a high up position in school. Instead, we just engage in the punishment of people who actually detract from community, and this is likely the most obvious counterfactual. With that out of the way, why is it the case that this is a norm which allows the exploitation of labour from the most vulnerable? The basic claim is what I think is alluded to in Closing Opposition's POI, which is that very often societies rely on people who work hard to keep that society up. For example, nurses that work in incredibly underpaid and overworked conditions, but they do so because they are promised rewards of you are a good person, I'm giving back to a citizen, and I'm going to be glorified from this. Volunteers who have to do things like maintain community spaces and give back in community service in order to ensure that society still runs. And we would explain that often this is a matter of existence for society is incredibly important. Society, as it exists in the status quo, does not find an alternative way to fill these roles, and they are incredibly important. The problem is that, as Opening Opposition explains, this norm is extraordinarily powerful and is able to essentially promise people the reward of glorification if they are to do these jobs, which they never get and which they should not believe in. And that's because it baits people into giving up their time in order to fulfill these community obligations, which they think will lead to their glorification and which they think will pay off. The problem is that this occurs to very few people. It is not everyone who, for instance, gives back to the debating circuit and runs competitions or goes out their way to give back their time and effort, but is instead very few people, and we would suggest this likely operates in a very pernicious ways on particular sets of people. First of all, it is most likely to be minority groups who are the most persuaded by this norm for two reasons. First of all, they perceive that they have the greatest debt to society because of opening government's observation, which they don't utilize, that this group is already accused of being bad, which explains why each minority feels as if they have an obligation to do more and solicit the glorification, which is why they're more likely to go out and give their time. But second of all, because it is these groups which are targeted most heavily by the norms, by the privileged who want to utilize their social capital in order to pressure people into doing things with the reward of glorification. But secondly, we would point out that in general it is likely to be the most disadvantaged people, because these are the people who lack the other statuses in society which are glorified to justify their position. People who are rich already feel as if they're entitled to be part of society, nor does it feel as if they're glorified, because that is obviously a thing which is celebrated in society. People who do not have access to things like financial success are most likely to only be able to rely on this social glorification, which is why this norm operates most strongly on them. There are two reasons, and importantly, this goes further than opening government's analysis that, well, people might want to be good people, because we explain specifically why this is a particularly pernicious narrative on a set of people, and why it genuinely coerces them with a promise of social glorification. There are two problems with this at face value. First of all, it is unfair that some people are allowed to benefit off a social norm and get rewarded from the labour of others merely because they weaponize that norm against them because they feel less pressured to be glorified. But second of all, we would explain that in fact it is not in fact that they do benefit. Because we would explain that not all people who engage in these good citizenship acts actually achieve the glorification. And this is where we're going to flip opening opposition's analysis. Because we would point out that although the idea of being a nurse is celebrated, the idea of doing community service is celebrated, the actual people who engage in these services never get the glorification they are promised. They are told that participating in that group is likely to give rise to their glorification in society, but they don't get things like raises, like better working conditions, like better things on their CV they can put later, which is the actual material benefit of glorification, which gives that emotional benefit. Instead, it is merely the promise, and it is abstract, and it is the excuse that people give. We are already appreciative for your work, which is the exact reason that we don't need to do things like give you extra service. We already have fulfilled our obligation to you by liking your work. Opening opposition.
Then without this narrative, you'd have less nurses and teachers.
I'm getting to it, relax. The counterfactual, though, is that we would suggest that the actual people who benefit from this glorification are those who are already structurally privileged. And that's because you need to have social structures which actually attribute the credentials, which suggest you are a good citizen and should be glorified. And very often this is awards that you need to have connections to be able to get, that you need to already exist within community structures. Look at the ways that, for instance, private schools hand out lots of prestigious awards to individuals that do get them better access to universities and do get them better access to jobs, even though they're not doing more service than anyone else, just because they have the power to access those rewards, which explains why it is the case that you actually get unfair access to an opening opposition role. Finally, why in the comparative is it going to be done? We would suggest that per all of my previous analysis, society needs this work to be done. And so in the counterfactual, they are forced to find an alternative way to encourage people to do the work. And we would suggest the way you encourage the people to do the work is by giving them meaningfully better conditions. This is the reason why if you need nurses in society, you pay them more so you can materially encourage people to do nursing. You don't overwork them because you have to make it an actually feasible career alternative, which explains one, why you're more likely to get better quality work out of these people because they're not being forced to work in incredibly harsh and emotionally manipulative conditions. But two, why we get a principal benefit because you're able to provide for them these more. We would explain this as a norm which is inaccessible to the people who are most persuaded by it to give up their time to do community service, but it's also one which meaningfully makes their life far, far worse.
Great, thank you so much for that speech. I now welcome the member of opposition.
Doctors, nurses, public servants all receive unique perks that are a reflection of the glorification they have in this society. But also that glorification is an incredibly important mechanism that reacts against countervailing norms that we're going to be the first team to describe in this debate that push people into the private sector, that push people away from socially utile jobs. We're also going to tell you about why this kind of norm is incredibly important when you interact with weak institutions and why it makes it easier to critique the state. Firstly, on the setting up the counterfactual here. I think the first thing to say is that there are a lot of countervailing norms that are predominantly that you should just look after yourself and look after your family. Those people are most proximate, you're incredibly emotionally attached to those people and also to yourself, and also there are also norms on top of that natural interest that mean that you should that encourage you to do well by yourself, that you ought seek out power, that you ought seek out the prestige of things like having a lot of money and having a strong family and things like this. That means that generally there is kind of a countervailing social norm outside of this, that one ought take what they want when they engage in social situations. They ought take what they want in the absence of norms that encourage them to engage with the state in a few ways. Firstly here, why does that interact particularly badly in regards to how we get people into socially utile jobs, particularly the public service? Noting here that given this is a civil narrative and it doesn't change a lot of things in the world in regards to, for instance, whether the state has power, what groups are locked out of accessing the levers of those power, probably the way in which this narrative most often comes into people's lives is when they are choosing ways in which they engage with the state or not, whether they're choosing to participate in things like the public service. Given that there are in fact other things that push people away from engaging in the civil society, in the public service, things like you earn more money in the private sector, and also countervailing narratives. Things like in the private sector, you're able to be innovative, you're able to be flexible, you're able to earn a lot of money, and there are glorified narratives in that other way. Note here, this is also responsive to everything that we heard from closing government here. Because if they tell you there are norms that those norms unjustly push you by accessing glorification in the public sector, there are also norms that push you into that glorification in the private sector in the same way that tell you that you should provide for your family, that you should for instance aim to have a big impact by becoming a consultant, or that you should aim to have a prestigious job at a corporate law firm, those same kinds of things are surely just as persuasive but less socially utile. This here also offers you a meaningful way to access glory and benefit and feeling good about yourself and good about the work that you do by entering the public service. Why is that incredibly important? Because it really sucks, particularly as a developing country, but as any country, when your productivity commission is made up of the whole bottom half of your economics cohort, right? When being a public servant is a consolation prize, that is incredibly bad for a few reasons. The first of which is just bad for development. Your government makes worse decisions. Your government has less capacity and is essentially in a regulatory competition war with the top half of the economics class. Or, for instance, you miss out on a lot of good biomed majors who don't choose to go into nursing or something like this. But also note, it means that you don't tend to get people who are powered by our respect for civil society, who are very sensitive to this narrative, going into a public sector where they're very unlikely to be corrupt, they're very likely to do their jobs well because they have someone who is sensitive to this narrative revealed by that particular, by the fact that they're in there. Note here, this also means you don't have to employ a lot of consultants as the public sector, which just saves you a lot of money and means you're able to upskill people within that. But lastly here, note, this is also particularly useful. We're able to co-opt the mechanism brought by opening government, which is that minorities are able to use this as a way that they are able to access the benefits of being a participant in civil society. This means that they're able to break down the mental barriers that exist to entering the public service, to entering a public service in a state that's maybe not particularly friendly towards them. That's incredibly good because having minorities in the public sector breaks down barriers. It convinces the other people within the public sector they ought not oppress this group. These people are okay. It creates long-term social impact, provides long-term social mobility to those communities. Note here, an incredibly material impact in a debate that has otherwise been incredibly speculative and has really been unable to tell me about how these other countervailing norms interact here. Next, why specifically does glorification actually get you more stuff? Noting here, public servants just do get perks. Public servants have permanency in the way no other job does. Doctors have huge amounts of pay and huge amounts of social respect. Maybe nurses could be paid more, but note, people are so sympathetic to nurses' strikes in the way they're sympathetic to no other job, right? People are actually generally do offer a great deal of sympathy to these groups, just asserted that they don't receive these kinds of perks and glory. But also note, just generally when we do glorify things, maybe you give them awards, but maybe you also give them more money and stuff like this. That's one of the ways that glorification is expressed. But also, if I want to value that glorification and that's my only way to access it, maybe I should be able to access it and feel good about myself and be I had a meaningful career and at the end of my life think about what a good and productive member of society I was. Sounds actually really baller. I'll take opening.
China uses the social credit system based on this narrative to penalise objectively good people in the majority, e.g. those who speak out, say, against weak Americans.
So the thing is...
How do these people speak out against the state?
So the thing is, you have to have a social credit system when you don't have a particularly strong version of this narrative, because that's something you have to do to punitively push people into participating in the civil service, rather than just having a narrative that already pushes them into the civil service and already pushes them into doing these things particularly well. That's actually a reaction to not having this narrative be particularly strong. Next here, why is it incredibly important that people buy into weak institutions? Note here, this goes just for post-conflict states, but it also goes for new regulatory bodies in the West. It goes to your local council, bodies that just maybe aren't super effective at doing their job, but it's often in your immediate best interest to engage with them, but it's still really important that you do. That looks like things it would be to your benefit as a corporation to cheat regulations from a weak regulatory body, or it will be as a belligerent, it will be in your interest to continue to attack the central government rather than to step down. But maybe this narrative often is something that causes you to believe that I should have a strong civil society, I should aim to participate, and I'm far more likely to just not engage in those things for those reasons. No, this gets over opening government, because they tell you about cases in the West where this might be in your best interest. We tell you the reason that this is good is because it encourages you, when it is not in your best interest, to act in this way, but it is in the best interest of society at large, which means that you are not likely to do in the counterfactual, take what's owed to you, continue to engage in war, continue to not pay your taxes, which means your state never develops the capacity, for instance, to build those strong institutions that might be good. This gets over that collective action problem. This means that also you're more likely to get people in your public service, incredibly good for building institutions in these types of weak states. Note here, the impact of at the end of that is like, that's how you establish strong central governments after conflict. That's how you establish your local council becoming effective because people pay their rates, because people engage in council meetings and stuff like that. Sometimes you just should buy into a weak institution even when it's worth criticising. But lastly, it probably makes things actually easier to criticise because you have a standard way of engaging with the kinds of processes of engaging with, like, in civil society, right? Everybody goes and they start doing their markers of like, I'm really patriotic, I'm a good citizen, I do these things. That is a shared ground that's really useful because often in political discussions, everyone wants good things, but they disagree on the means and the priorities. Setting that baseline makes those discussions more effective and far kinder. So proud to propose.
Great, thank you so much for that speech, and I now welcome Godfrey.
Symmetry in opening half is very obvious for the obvious reason that other narratives also exist, and I think both sides point this out to sufficiency, because OO says people need support and people generally, it is good if people are working towards this aspiration. OG says people kind of get support anyway because there are other narratives that exist. OO says no, but then society becomes better. But I think as to sufficiency, this already happens to a significant extent. Punishments for a breach of like community values still exist to a certain extent. What we are actually discussing and the contribution that we give you is why this aspiration and the existence of this glorification is actually in and of itself harmful, and the existence of this narrative causes people to aspire to a narrative that's inherently not accessible to them, and the people who are benefiting from it are people who like have access and only them have access, and that is like sort of a double harm. So we bring you two extensions. The first week, well, it is sort of one extension, which is the aspiration is a big thing. There are two really big impacts of this. The first is that minorities or people who are not able to access this aspiration and actually get there in the first place, like Sam explains, are like sort of locked out from that, but locked in a cycle of actually trying to gain this aspiration. They try to get there and they're not actually rewarded. For example, somebody might go into an industry thinking, oh, I'm doing lots of work for society, and it's often people who like are not privileged who go into industries that people see as public service, right? As OO suggests. And so they are not actually rewarded in the way that they should be, but they are in fact rewarded with a glorification that is not materially contributing to like a benefit on their side. So that's why exploitation, like as in it leads to more exploitation of labor. But second, that we explain why it is inherently inaccessible, and it entrenches existing power structures that are at play, because the people who are now known as good citizens and get rewards for getting good, like for being a good citizen, are people who are naturally able to do so, people who are like the son of a mayor or something, who don't actually do the community service, like being a bus driver, which is not glorified, versus you are the son of a mayor who has like had given a speech about human rights, and now suddenly you are glorified. This is a very big harm, because what this means is that people are continuously undergoing, not unpaid, I guess, but very lowly paid labor to reach a goal that they're never going to actually get, and people who are already at that goal are going to get the benefits of this narrative. So let's address OO and CG, but I'll take the opening.
If your counterfactual only punishes being a bad citizen but doesn't reward good citizenship, doesn't that mean you accept the OG risk of backlash against individual minorities but don't provide a positive pathway that allows communities to access good citizenship and the community that brings?
Well, like, our burden is not to establish that there is a positive way to do it. We're just saying that the glorification is bad. Like, as in that we oppose this narrative. Like, essentially, that's not our burden. So, on OO, I think the main claim from OO here, well, there's a few. The first is that people can sort of access citizenship with positive acts, and this is a good thing. I think we successfully flip this claim by just saying, like, this is not a good thing, because the people who have access to these positive acts, as Sam explains, to no response, is like people who already are in these positions of power and who already have access to this good citizenship, this like epithet of of good citizenship. So this narrative is harmful. The fact that people need to take positive acts to do so is harmful because people will keep trying to do these positive acts. They will keep going into roles that underpay them. They will keep doing this type of labor without any alternative because this narrative tells society and tells people and tells the government that glorification is sufficient, that glorification is enough to get people to go into public sectors, that you do not have to pay these people enough to incentivize them to go into these industries. They will do so anyway because being a nurse is like really good for the society and you are a good citizen if you do so. These are the people that we care about. Second, we explain why it is actually given to people who are privileged. I think this is, I've said this like ad nauseum. So like people who can access citizenship through positive acts, like this benefit does not actually apply to most of the population because people can only access it if they already are in that position of privilege. And I think that takes out most of what OO says. Moving on then to CG. I think CG's main claim is that essentially glorification means people that go into public service, right? People go into public service and that is like why this is good because we incentivize them to go into these services. But I would point out a few things. The first is that there are already existing incentives for people to encourage people to go into public services. So for example, if you're the government and you need nurses, you need some sort of incentive to get them there. They're not just gonna be like, oh, we don't have enough nurses because they're not glorified. Oh no, let's not have nurses. What they're gonna do is they're gonna find other incentive to do so. In the absence of a glorification narrative that actively displaces a different type of incentive, what happens is the incentive has to become something that is more material. The incentives has to be, oh, we're now gonna pay people more, because if you don't do that, because there's no glorification narrative, as the whole room points out, you are not going to get people into the public sector. The government is not stupid. They have an incentive to encourage people to go into these sectors anyway, and so that harm does not stand. So that's why there are existing incentives. Second, I think they also claim that now you have a better workforce in that area because smart people or people who are educated will now go into these types of services. I think this is kind of untrue because as Sam explains, they don't need this type of if it is true that they are already getting awards, they are already going to they're already being awarded for being a good citizen because they are in the position to be awarded doing that because they were born into a privileged family. It's very unclear why that extra incentive would affect them in any way. Because if they care about being a good citizen and they've got an award for hi, I'm a good citizen, they're not going to be actually I need an underpaying job to make me seem like more of a good citizen that does not give me the extra benefit of having a piece of paper in my house. So unclear why that stands. Fourth of all, I think, actually this is kind of what I said before, but let me just whip it again. But people are still able to thank, this is not what I said before, this is very unique. People are still thankful for services that are provided to them. So for example, if somebody is a nurse or something, or if somebody is a bus driver, people can still thank them through other means. And what that means is that when you remove the narrative, as I said, the countervailing incentive to actually remunerate in a real and material way must necessarily fill the gap that is left by the removal of this narrative. So our claim is that this narrative takes up space for incentive, and once you remove that, and because this gap necessarily exists because people need these services to exist and people are thankful for these services being provided, you have to fill these with things that actually materially affect and benefit people's lives. And these people who are aspiring towards this being a good citizen no longer have to do so. They just go into these jobs because they're actually well paid for them, and that is a good thing.
So, firstly, bear with me. I'm trying out a new style of judging, which is on paper. So if the OA is messy, I'm sorry, but I'm just giving it a crack because hashtag my judge feedback, not that important. So I'm going to give myself the opportunity to try. Okay, so I have a few pieces of feedback. The first one is, I think that all of us didn't explain why the benefits or harms were unique to this norm. So there was just way too much symmetricizing in this debate. It's we have X, Y, Z other things without actually being why is this the tipping point? So I guess the piece of feedback is doing more tipping point analysis. I think some teams gave it a kind of crack, but I think that needed to be much more clear, specifically because this debate, I feel like any norms debate, it's always going to be a bit messy, but I think it made it even more messy because it wasn't clear why this was actually the tipping point. The second thing is that there was too much mitigation. And mitigation was kind of the go-to, and then there was flipping. So it's I'll do a few pieces of mitigation and then I'll flip. It's let's flip and then do the mitigation rather than in the opposite order. The rest of my feedback is going to be integrated, but also is quite specific to individual teams, and is also kind of about the cases that we ran, in that I think there were just intuitive arguments that we missed in the top half specifically. And I think just like go for the low-hanging fruit in debates like this, rather than the kind of much larger scale arguments. It's like you can kind of go smaller and win bigger. Okay, so we saw this as a back half. We gave the first to CG, the second to CO, the third to OO, the fourth to OG. I'm going to explain that now. So, firstly, on opening government, I think that you guys bring sort of one broad contribution and the rest comes out in response. And that is that this norm or this kind of narrative is particularly bad in countries that have bad governments for the reason that people use it as a reason to attack minorities. So for example, if one black person does a bad thing, they kind of label that whole group as bad citizens, and that is bad. But the second thing is that it distracts the public from the government. So the rhetoric is like the groups are the bad citizens rather than the governments being the bad citizens. And that means that you have less incentive to enact changes. So bringing in OO, and then we're going to bring in the kind of contributions in terms of responsive. So OO has two things. I think the first thing is more important. So the first one is that this leads to a better society for the reason that people internalize this narrative from when they're quite young, and that means that they're likely to go out of their way not just to help their own communities, but to help citizens more generally. For example, by doing things like volunteering for charity or donating money or whatever, but even just like helping their neighbors or helping people who aren't their neighbors, for example. But secondly, they explain that this means that the law enforcement costs are lower because people have the incentive to be good citizens. So for example, maybe less people drunk drive, for example. The second thing that they say is that the counterfactual is that good citizenship would be tied to social contracts. So it would be about like religion, for example, or race. And this is better because it's more inclusive and easier to integrate. The response from opening government to this is to say, firstly, people are likely still going to be good citizens because there's still a moral impetus. I think the problem with this response is that it's really clear what the difference is in good citizenship and good personhood. And I think you guys don't delineate clearly enough what that actually looks like, such that I think these guys are able to claim that this definitely does swing you in the vibe of being a more good person. But the second thing they explain is that under this norm, you do good things for others for the reason that you want something in return. And it's like, that may be true, but I think they are able to prove that when this norm exists, you probably do both. So you do good things because you get good things in return, but you also do good things because you think you should be a good citizen. So I think they're able to claim the benefits to society. Secondly, in relation to the counterfactual, the response from opening government is that, well, the state weaponizes this in a bad way because they say, as you guys mentioned earlier, that everyone is bad citizens if they're a part of a particular race, for example. But the second and much better response is that, well, if the state has failed people, you don't have an obligation to be a good citizen. So at the point where you're living in a shitty country with a corrupt government, it's unclear why you should actually act in a way that's useful for that society. The response from OO here, I think, is a fewfold. The first thing is that if you're in a bad state, you probably don't want to be a good citizen. So like, you don't even want to be a citizen in the first place. And I think the example of Indigenous Australians is helpful there. But secondly, and the much better response, is that clearly that is not about this narrative, right? Like, there are a whole bunch of other reasons why these groups of people are structurally oppressed. It's not about this narrative, and it's just unclear why this is the tipping point to making minorities' lives so much worse. So even if they're made a little bit worse, it's unclear to me why this is the thing that's actually pushing them into like having more microaggressions done against them or more people attacking them in society, for example. So at the end of the top half, two reasons why OO gets up. The first is that, again, I don't think OG proves exclusively why this is the issues that are going to be caused with minorities, but OO is able to prove that this isn't the tipping point for minorities, but it is the tipping point for being a good person. So it's like they kind of can undercut all of your harms and claim a whole bunch of benefits by explaining it's only the tipping point for the good part of the narrative, which is able to, for them, means that they can kind of get ahead in quite a useful way. Okay, bringing in closing government and kind of then comparing the short diagonal and the gov bench. So CG, I think, has two extensions, the second one being more important. The first one is an explanation that there's still going to be a punishment for being cruel, even if we don't have this good citizenship narrative. So they're kind of able to explain that the worst things probably don't happen even at the removal of this narrative because people kind of don't want to be a dick. But secondly, and far more importantly, this narrative is pernicious in that it means that you exploit labour, specifically in relation to minorities. And the useful part about this extension is it's kind of able to co-opt everything else that's been said so far in the debate about minorities by explaining that this narrative is used as a kind of weapon to be able to get these people into unpaid labour and glorify roles, for example, like nursing or whatever, or teaching, because people feel like they're going to get glorified for that. And the explanation they explain is that minorities are the ones that are most likely to opt into this because they don't get status in other ways. So this is a useful way for them to get status. But the problem is that often that glorification doesn't actually come to fruition. So they try and and get it, but they never actually achieve it. And they explain that the counterfactual is that there are other ways to incentivize people into becoming nurses, for example, like paying them more. So it's better to pay them more than it is to glorify them, even if there are some benefits of glorification. So in terms of how this interacts with the short diagonal, I think firstly, CG is able to explain that minorities go too far in fulfilling this norm. So OO is like, it's an accessible norm. It means that people are good citizens and work for their communities. But CG is like, that's true, but it's too much, and it actually means that they end up screwing themselves over. But secondly, I think that they're able to explain that we improve minorities' lives better on their side because we pay them more if they're in those types of careers. And if the rhetoric and the kind of weighing from OO is about minority groups, CG is neatly able to explain that they're able to impact them better. Even if you guys explain how they can be integrated better, we should care more about their livelihoods than we should about their perception. I think that's a useful piece of weighing. Okay, let's compare the Gov bench. I think there's 3 reasons why CG gets up. Firstly, I think CG just takes a much broader swing. Like, they're not just focused in bad governments and corrupt states. I think they're more broadly focused in that their arguments fit into multiple contexts. But second of all, I think they explain better than you guys, and actually in a POI at the start of LO, that like the law still exists to encourage the worst, to discourage the worst types of behaviour. But thirdly, I think they fill in the reasons of why minorities get screwed. So it's not that they get attacked, as you guys say, it's that they get exploited. And I think those 2 things are discrete from each other. And the exploitation, in my mind anyway, seems more obvious than the attack, specifically in relation to this narrative. Okay, let's bring in CO. CO, contributions are threefold, and I think they're quite clever. Integrating feedback, I think that you should have gone for 1 rather than 3, and I think maybe that could have been useful. But they are threefold. The first is that this countervails other norms, for example, like self-interest, and that means that people are more likely to be work in the public sector, for example, because now that you get that you get prestige in the way of glorification, which means that you care less about things like flexibility and money, because you can use that as a reason to opt into the public sector instead. And the explanation is that this is important because it's actually, if it is minorities, as CG says, that opts in, that's good because you're able to get the benefit of having minorities in the public sector. And I think that's actually quite a clever piece of mechanization. The second thing you explain is that there are a bunch of perks of glorification, like the permanence of public service and sympathy. And thirdly, you explain that in relation to weak institutions, actually it's sometimes good to opt into those institutions because that's what supports them in the long term and means that states that are, for example, post-conflict are more likely to develop quicker because more people are engaging in good faith. So comparing the back half, noting that this I think is by far the closest split in the debate, and it is quite hard to adjudicate. So the reason why I ended up falling in favour of CG is twofold. Firstly, because I don't think that CO, you guys ever properly explain why it is better to encourage people with glorification than it is with money. So why is it that minorities are more likely to lean into the glorification norm than they are to just getting a higher paycheck? But secondly, you say, well, there'll be like political capital because people have sympathy and that leads to higher wages. The problem that argument runs into is if that were true, then why aren't they getting paid more now? Because this norm exists in the status quo. It's not like we're adding this norm in. So it's like, if this norm already exists, why does that sympathy not lead to political capital and then not lead to higher wages? So I think that kind of has a context problem. And then thirdly, I think that CG is able to explain, oh, actually, I kind of have already said that. So I guess that's kind of the reason why CG is able to get up over CO. And also I think that CG is able to provide a meaningful benefit and an actual concrete benefit to minorities rather than just it's good to have them in public service. It's unclear why they have that specific obligation as well. So even if it's good to have them there, why do they actually owe that to society more than they just owe things to themselves, for example, bettering their lives and through money? In relation to the op bench, 2 reasons why CO gets up over OO. Firstly, I think that their analysis is just more specific. So I think that they're actually able to explain, you guys like they help society, CO's like they help the public sector. Even though society is broader, I think just likelihood, I understand why the public sector actually gets helped. And they explain why this norm is the tipping point for this specific group, which I think is able to get them up. In terms of the long diagonal, I think that CO really neatly flips your stuff on state failures by explaining that even in bad states, you should still cooperate with them because that's better for the whole, and this is a useful narrative and encouraging people to do that. But second of all, I think all of their stuff about minorities is also able to flip your stuff about how they get attacked. So that's the OA. Hope it makes sense. If not, happy to answer questions, and good luck for the silent round.